Hi, I'm Randy Riley. I'm the state librarian at the Library of Michigan. And each year, the Library of Michigan coordinates the Michigan Notable Books program, where we select 20 books by Michigan authors about Michigan things, Michigan places, and we find ways to promote it and send them across the state to different libraries, the authors, to talk about their books. Obviously, this year has created quite a few challenges to that plan, and we have had to do things virtually. Each April, we have the Night for Notables event, and it's a big celebration where we bring in the authors and have a keynote speaker. This year's keynote speaker was supposed to be the guest that we're having today, Hank Meijer. And instead of doing a big celebration keynote, he has been kind enough to give us some of his time to talk about Michigan books, notable books, and his writing process. So hello, Hank, and thank you for being a part of the program.
Hi, Randy. It's my pleasure.
And let me tell a little bit about, if people don't know who Hank Meijer is. Hank Meijer is the co-chairman and co-CEO of Meijer Inc. He joined the family business when he was 11 as a grocery clerk. After serving as a reporter for a Detroit area suburban newspaper group, he became the editor and later a publisher of a weekly newspaper in Plymouth, Michigan. In 1979, he rejoined Meijer as the advertising director. In 1984, he published Thrifty Years, a biography of Hendrik Meijer, the company's founder, and his grandfather. And in 2018, his book, Arthur Vandenberg, The Man in the Middle of an American Century, was recognized as a Michigan Notable Book. So welcome, Hank Meijer.
Well, it's great to be with you today, Randy, and being a part of Michigan Notable Books has been a real honor.
Right. You found huge success in your professional, your corporate life out there. What draws you back to wanting to write?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm an old reporter originally out of college, and I was an English major in college, and so writing has just been always an important form of expression for me. And where my wife is a fiction writer, I found myself unable to create characters, but I found that biography was a great way to blend a love of writing and a love of history, and a way to take a character and explore and understand and describe that character.
Having that skill set to write, to do that research, has it helped you in your job at Meijer? I mean, as you approach things, has it made you a different kind of CEO of a big company?
Well, I have to say I'm actually no longer the CEO. I'm the chairman of our board, but I don't want to make any grand claims. I would like to think that understanding narrative is a way of, is as such a fundamental way to communicate, that if we think about our business, we're really trying to tell a story. We're trying to tell a story to our customers. We're trying to engage with our customers, and storytelling is a way to do that. So I could, in a general way, I could say it helps, but I don't know that it, I don't know how much it has to do with keeping the shelves well stocked.
How often do you find time to write, and are you researching, working on anything right now?
Well, it's I have to say, since my second book took me the better part of 30 years, I am not a good example of disciplined writing, and I've always had to balance it with a day job. But I find it really important, and maybe I don't have any other healthier hobbies I should be concentrating on, to have a writing project. I find it an intellectual challenge and a real motivator. And so as soon as I finished the work on Arthur Vandenberg, I was eager to start another book. And so, but at a loss immediately for what that should be, because I had lived with this senator from Grand Rapids for so many years, and in some ways came to identify with that character so much that it was really hard to think of someone else who to take on. And one of the great motivators in working on Vandenberg was there had never been a complete biography of him. And so there was a real sense of mission associated with that project. And how could I recapture that? And so, in the recent months, I've been thinking real hard about another Michigan character, another Michigan political figure, contemporary with Vandenberg, but very different in his life and outlook. And that is Frank Murphy, who was mayor of Detroit in the early 1930s, and then appointed by President Roosevelt to be first Governor General and then High Commissioner of the Philippines, preparing them for independence before World War II, and then came back to run for governor of Michigan, was governor of Michigan in 1936 to 38, and then was defeated for re-election, appointed Attorney General by Roosevelt, served just for a year in 1939, and then became the first Michigander to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, the only Michigander, where he served from 1940 until his death in 1949. And very different character from Arthur Vandenberg, although a contemporary in politics, so I understand the political milieu a little bit. But the very differences make it appealing. I have to learn about Catholicism and the law and the Supreme Court, and so it becomes a stimulating sort of intellectual challenge to take on somebody, not someone you identify with completely, but someone you ordinarily wouldn't identify with, and try to understand his character.
And I mean, you obviously have this keen interest in the state of Michigan and the various authors and political figures that, and you individually and Meijer as a company has been super generous to the historical community and libraries and book people across the state. I mean, you were instrumental in the Jim Harrison papers going to Grand Valley State University. You've helped Wayne State University with their Great Lakes writing series of books. Meijer has been extremely supportive of the Michigan Notable Books program. Why is that? I mean, why is that important to you? Why has it been important to Meijer as a company to support things like that, the historical societies as well?
I think a couple of different things. One is in understanding who we are as individuals and as communities, I think we have to appreciate a sense of place. And I mean, we're all from somewhere, and what does that mean to us? And for those of us who are from Michigan or who live in Michigan, what's the context of our lives? And I think appreciating that sense of place is part of it. And then really, if you think about it, our writers are in many ways our collective voice as a state, and very diverse voices, but together they compose how we can understand ourselves, how we can read about experiences in Michigan. I heard the interview with Dean Kuipers talking about his boyhood and his family's passion for the outdoors growing up in Kalamazoo. These are his story, and the stories of others like him come together to really help define what it means to live where we live and to be the Michigan citizens that we are.
Yeah, and I mean, like talking to Michigan authors, and someone like Dean is a good example. He hasn't lived in Michigan forever, but you start talking about that piece of land and that place where he grew up, and you can almost see him inflate and light up because of the importance and the connection he still makes. I think that's great. Talking a little bit, which writers do you find yourself reading?
Well, my reading I'm a slow reader, and so I have to be painstaking in what I choose. And because I find myself involved in biography projects, a lot of my reading is research toward those projects. And so while I might be as I mentioned, my wife's a fiction writer, and in fiction, I'm a huge fan of Alice Munro's short stories, and I grew up loving John Updike. I My reading today tends to be concentrated on my research for my subjects, and so with Vandenberg, a lot of research on U.S. foreign policy, a lot of books there. With Murphy, my summer reading, of course, it's an excuse to learn new things. So Murphy was Irish, an Irish American with an avid interest in Irish independence, and so this summer I found myself reading Tom Lynch's memoir, Booking Passage, another great Michigan book,
Yes.
And as well as Tom Stanton's Terror in the City of Champions, about crime and Ku Klux Klan-like behavior in Detroit in the 1930s, which again overlapped with Murphy's time in Detroit. And so those were two great works of nonfiction that I enjoyed this summer, as well as books on the Supreme Court.
Right. And you mentioned before earlier that your wife, Lisa Litzenberger, is a fantastic author as well. Her book, The Widower, was a Michigan Notable Book in 2007. Every time I see you, I think I ask you, hey, when is Lisa going to write another book? Does she have another one in her? Because I really like her writing. And you obviously are very much a book person. What's it like in your home? Is there an expectation of your children, your family? Are books a big part of it? Is reading a big part of it?
Certainly for Liesl and me. I mean, it's hard to know with the kids what will excite them. Our daughter is enjoying Harry Potter right now, not an uncommon phenomenon, and Liesl is kind of nudging them toward the classics as we work to supplement their. For our listeners, they're seventh graders right now, and so facing the challenges of a difficult educational environment. So, but we have, as you can imagine, a lot of books, and in many ways we have Liesl and I have overlapping interests, even though she may write fiction. She got her MFA at Western Michigan University and studied with, and I did some graduate work in history there, and we have friends who were her teachers and fellow faculty members and friends of mine, and she ran the writing program at Interlochen before teaching at Central Michigan, and so we have a lot of Michigan writers in common who were friends of ours before we met each other.
Yeah, and I look at even my own home with my two children who are now both out of college, but my son is sort of a read for a purpose type of reader, and my daughter is a read for enjoyment, whatever, give me books, and is always reading something. And you would think, I've been trying to push books with my son, sort of, if it fits a research project or something, or how to fix something, he may be all over it, but to read for pleasure, I've failed with him in that one. So yeah, I keep trying though.
Well, and you hope it by osmosis, but it doesn't happen automatically.
No, it doesn't. You've talked a lot about your book on Senator Vandenberg. What drew you into him, and what motivated you to write that book? I mean, it took you a while to finish it, but you were publishing articles and different things about him all along the way, and sort of developing as a Vandenberg expert. Why him, besides he was from West Michigan, and was that the main draw?
It wasn't the main one, but it was a curious story. So when I had been in the newspaper business in Plymouth, and when I came back to Grand Rapids and started working in the advertising department at Meijer, part of the enticement coming back, my dad had asked me if I would consider writing a history of our company. I wasn't really interested in the corporate history, but my grandfather, who didn't open our first grocery store in Greenville until he was 50 years old, had already lived most of his life as a as a small town barber, but beyond that, coming out of both he and my grandmother out of a radical political milieu in the Netherlands and discovering a different outlook in America. And that immigrant story, which was also kind of a love story because my grandmother saved all these letters that they had exchanged for 5 years while he was here and she was in the Netherlands, became the basis for that biography. And I just found myself loving biographical research and the kind of character sketches that go into biography. And so Gordon Olson, who may be familiar to some Michigan Notable Books readers, is a good friend of mine, retired city historian in Grand Rapids. And back in 1980, 89 or so, he was responsible that year for the Michigan Historical Society of Michigan's annual meeting program. And for some of our listeners who may have attended such functions, there will be a keynote speaker, and then there will be all these breakout sessions with small groups on particular topics. And he was trying to fill out his dance card, basically. He needed to fill out his program. And I had done a lot of research at the Grand Rapids Library on my grandfather, and he and I had talked a lot. I've always been interested in American foreign policy, and it kept running across Vandenberg's name. And except that there was a professor teaching in Chicago then who had published his dissertation at Michigan as the first of a projected 2-volume biography of Arthur Vandenberg. And so I can recall thinking to myself and sharing with Gordon, I'd like to write about Arthur Vandenberg, but the world doesn't need 2 biographies, and presumably this guy is working on a 2nd volume. And so I don't know what to do. And so Gordon said, well, I need people to speak at my program. You don't have to write a biography, but just talk about some phase of Vandenberg's career. And this was in, I think, 1989. And so I talked about the neutrality debates in the US before World War II and spoke before about 6 people at the Historical Society's annual meeting, and turned that into an article for the Michigan Historical Review. But just a few weeks after I gave that talk, I get a call from the adult daughter of this professor in Chicago, who, as it turned out, had died and had a lot of illness and I think some personal and emotional problems. And she was closing up his house in Wilmette to sell it, and wondered what to do with all of his files on Arthur Vandenberg. Now, this is before the age of digitization. These were Xerox copies of materials from the Roosevelt Library, the Truman Library, the State Department, the British Foreign Office, things that he had amassed that had no monetary value. She had checked with libraries and they had no interest in it, but she hated to throw all of her father's lifetime of research away. So she called the Historical Society of Michigan and said, do you know of anybody with an interest in Arthur Vandenberg? The only person they knew of was me, because I'd spoken at their conference a few weeks earlier. And so they gave her my number. She called me, and I ended up bringing a van load of papers back to Grand Rapids, and suddenly going from thinking the world doesn't need 2 biographies of Arthur Vandenberg to saying, if not me, who? And
you're
also,
the guy.
I was working at the time and really couldn't afford, didn't have any research assistants or graduate assistants or anything. And so how was I going to, there were no sabbaticals in my line of work. How was I going to spend weeks at these libraries? And so I inherited all of these papers, and that allowed me to do the most fun part of the research as an old reporter, and that was to interview people who were still alive and remembered Vandenberg. So I inherited a treasure trove of research materials, and I gained a sense of mission, and it was off to the races. And a quarter of a century later,
there you go.
and so, of course, being a first-time biographer, yes, one of the hazards of historical research is, when do you stop? because there's
Right.
always another book to read, another file to explore, another library to check out. And I had a manuscript that was approaching 1,200 pages that no one was ever going to read. And so I could chip away at it. And I spent literally years taking a line out here and a paragraph there and reducing it to 1,123 pages and then 1,034 pages. And at that rate, I was never going to find a publisher and never going to have a manuscript anybody would want to read. And so finally, I started working with an editor who was much more brutal on me than I could do on myself, and said, slam together chapters 1 and 2, eliminate chapter 3, condense this down, condense that down. And I finally had a manuscript that was at least presentable to a publisher. And then University of Chicago Press, something that I'm sure they wouldn't do to a writer of any stature, but I was so grateful for their interest. In their contract, they wrote, take it down to 156,000 words when I had was still at 180,000 or something. So I had to chop further, and finally we had a manuscript.
It does. I mean, again, I showed the book. It does not feel chopped like you're talking about how you had to do it. It's a very solid, well-researched book that I recommend highly to anyone who's interested in not just Michigan history, but politics and politics of the era. And I mean, you can't overstate how huge Vandenberg was to how the United States' approach to foreign policy. It has still lasting impact to this day. And when you look at him as being a extreme isolationist in the beginning to where he was at the end of his career, and is a pretty amazing story in itself.
Well, and it was a story that hadn't been told. He died in office. He was an old journalist himself, but never lived to write his memoir. And there was an earlier would-be biographer who was a newspaper reporter here in Grand Rapids who left a wonderful set of scrapbooks that are also at the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan, but didn't live to write the biography. And then the papers I inherited came from another would-be biographer. And so nobody told his story. And that's the way history works. If somebody doesn't tell your story, you slip between the cracks. And the people around you who tell their own story, whose stories are being told, sort of crowd you out. And I think he was in that situation. And the year after my book came out, an author at the Council on Foreign Relations came out with a wonderful book on the Marshall Plan, which Vandenberg had been instrumental in putting through the Senate. And he talks a bit about Vandenberg, and I got a call from one of the think tanks in Washington and from one of their foreign policy experts, and he said, I was reading Ben Stiles' book on the Marshall Plan, and I kept seeing references to Vandenberg. And, who was this guy? I didn't know anything about him. So I had to go, and then I looked it up, and you just wrote a book about him. And so, that's how you hope you have a little bit of an influence on, both as a Michigander, striking a blow for the importance of someone from our state, and for recalibrating how people think about an important time in that post-war period when
exactly.
the United States was helping put the world back together, and Vandenberg was right in the middle of it.
Right. Well, I thought, I know Vandenberg. He was a very powerful senator. But to read your book, it's like, wow, his impact was even greater than I imagined, and I thought I knew a little bit about him. How do you think he would fare in today's political climate?
At the most basic level, he would probably be primaried, he wouldn't survive a primary. And people ask the same question about President Ford, who viewed Vandenberg as sort of a hero and mentor. They had a style of moderation, and of course Vandenberg was most notable for his championing of bipartisan foreign policy, saying, politics stops at the water's edge, folks. We've got to present a united front to the world and figure out how to work together to do that. And that is no longer in fashion. And
A
so
lot of politicians could learn from that today.
absolutely. I mean, it's a model, but it's something where our polarization today pulls people to left and right and makes the whole notion of compromise a little suspect. And he did everything with compromise. He figured out, he's a Republican working with the Democrats in the Roosevelt and then the Truman administration, looking for, and often the party in the minority, looking for ways to craft important legislation to, from the United Nations to NATO with Marshall Plan in between, to make, to do this very important work. You couldn't do it ramming it through with one party or the other. You needed to work together. And that's what he was an expert at.
Right. And I think a lot of political figures today could learn a lot from the actions and the way Vandenberg went about doing his business. I mean, he was, compromise was a win, not a loss.
Exactly.
Today, it always seems like it feels like a loss. In writing, you talked about some of the challenges, but what would you say is the hardest part for you to write besides finding the time to do it?
I think finding the for anyone doing history or biography, the challenge is to find the storyline, to find how is your character developing? Don't just recite the chronological details or let the events sort of overpower the character. But what's happening? You're trying to climb inside the head of this character and look at the world the way they looked at the world, not the way we look back on them, but how they looked at it. And that's the biggest challenge, trying to say, I've got to be true to the facts. This is history, this is biography, this isn't fiction. I've got to be true to the facts, but I need to work with them imaginatively enough to draw out a personality who I never met, who was died before I was born. And that getting into someone else's head is the biggest challenge for me.
And I've heard you speak about Senator Vandenberg before, and even today in our conversation. I think it's pretty obvious that maybe like's not the word, but respect him and what he did and what he accomplished. Could you have written that book if you didn't have that respect, or you didn't have sort of, admire might be too strong of a word too, but if you didn't see him as holding up something worth everybody else knowing about?
Probably not. It wouldn't be as much fun. I mean, I think that's one of the great questions, Randy, of particularly of biography. And one of the great living biographers, of course, is Robert Caro, who's done his multi-volumes on Lyndon Johnson. And as he learned more about Lyndon Johnson, he learned more about some of the corruption and shortcomings associated with Johnson's life, and yet it was a career that did some landmark things, particularly in terms of civil rights legislation that no other president had achieved. And right. So you're always trying to balance that. I mean, you want a warts and all portrait. That's a given. And I was just reading something where that expression comes from. Apparently, is the English authoritarian ruler, shall we say, Oliver Cromwell, and what was that, in the 16th century or something? Cromwell talking to the painter who was painting his portrait, and said, if you can't paint me with all my warts and wrinkles, you're not worth being paid. In other words, be true to who I am. You've got to do that. But I think in my own case, that's important to me, not to just write a hagiography of laudatory work, but you want to find someone whose life has elements in it that we can learn from, and you find things to admire as well as to have reservations about. And And if you're going to live with somebody as long as some of us live with these characters, I think that's essential. I couldn't imagine, it's people say, well, how do you write about Hitler or some loathsome figure? And I wouldn't want to do that. I want to be true to the figure, but have someone who's got characteristics that you can connect with.
So going back to your writing and trying to publish this book, do you think being Hank Meijer of the Meijer Corporation helped or hindered you in that whole process of trying to find a publisher? And because I'm trying to think of other people in your position in their business life that are writing similar books to this. And I'm sure there are some out there. I don't know of them, but I mean, I think it's a pretty remarkable history that you were able to do and run and partly run with your family, this huge corporation of Meijer. But I mean, did it help or hurt you in this whole process of trying to get published?
Well, on balance, I think it helped a little bit because you're something of a curiosity. And so that, that may help. It's not like you have celebrity status, and so somebody is going to automatically publish it. And on balance, it helps. I mean, I think it's like, oh, well, this is interesting. How's this guy pulling this off? I think that curiosity is a plus. But I found myself, but I not coming writing in a genre where writers are often academics, if not journalists, and not being active in either of those professions. Also have to work a little harder to establish my credibility. And so on balance, I think it's a plus because it gets you're more likely to get your foot in the door. But people are also going to kind of look askance, and it's not an exact parallel, but I really admire poetry and have written a few little mediocre poems in my life. And but we have in Grand Rapids, there's a local poetry contest, and 30 years ago, a little poem I wrote happened to be the winner in the adult division that year. And the little newspaper account in the Grand Rapids Press of that year's winners, talking about my background, said he dabbled in journalism. And now I was only a reporter and editor for about 5 years, but our little weekly newspaper in Plymouth was one of the great weekly newspapers in Michigan. We won some great awards, and we had a wonderful time doing it. But that notion, dabbled in journalism, it's like, well, he's this kid in the family business, and that's really what he was meant to do, but he dabbled in journalism. So you have to, in that way, work a little harder to be taken seriously in your other enterprise, because it's overshadowed by the Meijer thing, even as the Meijer thing helps open doors because people say, well, this sounds interesting. I'll talk to him.
Yeah, and that's a solid, well-researched history. And probably that's the thing. A lot of people dabbled in journalism, probably don't really understand the skill you have in when you did that in a past part of your working career. Obviously, it helps.
I did do graduate work in history at Western Michigan, and so I did my grandfather's book, and I didn't properly footnote it, or it might have been the master's thesis that would have given me a little more credibility. So.
Right. Would you like to take a moment and read a section from the book? Is there a passage that you find is a good example of the content?
Sure. Just maybe a couple of paragraphs from a couple of different sections of the book. The very start of the book, and this is Arthur Vandenberg, the man in the middle of the American century, because both of them have also tie back into some of the fun of research. But here's the first two paragraphs of the prologue. Arthur Vandenberg's stature owed something to his size and swagger as well as his political authority. Gore Vidal, drawing on childhood memories, described him somewhat sardonically as the Great Van. Whether briefing reporters or holding forth at a diplomatic reception, he could command the room. It was not always so. The American senator drank a little more than he could conveniently manage, wrote his hostess, the wife of the Argentine ambassador, in her diary in 1934. He had emerged from the embassy library, pale and unsteady after brandy and cigars. He stumbled over the Aubusson carpet, knocked against a slender French chair, but managed to right himself in order to walk out in proper senatorial dignity. Why is it, she mused, that the American man has never been able to drink? Or is it that he has never learned to drink? Arthur Vandenberg was nothing if not dignified, but she might have asked what else the imposing senator with the bright, dark eyes had to learn, for the answer would have foretold momentous lessons for the American people, too. And this is in his early days as a senator in Washington when he cut a colorful figure, but hadn't amounted to much as a senator yet. And then jumping ahead, that's 1934 to 1943. In the intervening years, he had become an antagonist of Roosevelt. He's a Republican fighting a lot of the New Deal legislation and also fighting for American neutrality. That was his gold star. He was a great admirer of Alexander Hamilton, and he before World War II, as Roosevelt, FDR is trying to come to the aid of the British and French to help them prepare for the threat of Hitler. He's promoting legislation to guarantee American neutrality, to say we won't sell arms to anyone who's a belligerent. And in fact, if you've seen that movie, The Darkest Hour of Winston Churchill, that came out a couple of years ago, there's a moment when it's a fictional moment, but Churchill is on the phone to Roosevelt begging him for the release of arms that the British have ordered. And Roosevelt's saying, I can't do it. It was Vandenberg who was leading the fight to keep him from doing that. And so then war breaks out, and the isolationist position is really discredited. And the Republicans are defeated in 1940, and the election of 1944 is rolling around. And Vandenberg is in the middle between the isolationists who, like Robert Taft, who don't want to have anything to do with foreign wars, and the internationalists like Wendell Willkie, who had run and lost in 1940, who was really basically following FDR's lead in interventionist foreign policy. And the Republicans have a meeting up on Mackinac Island to try to figure out in 1943 in the fall what their platform should be to run on in 1944. And Vandenberg is charged with pulling these two wings of the Republican Party, still have those two wings today, between people who follow the president with his America First stuff and people embodied by people like John McCain, who are much more internationalist and concerned with cultivating our alliances. Vandenberg was trying to pull those people together in 1943 at this conference at the Grand Hotel. I'll just read a couple of paragraphs.
Great.
At the ebb of summer 1943, ferries carried delegates across the choppy straits of Mackinac toward the island and its great hotel. Up on the bluff, American flags fluttered as if celebrating a perpetual 4th of July. Between soaring Doric columns on the Grand's famous porch, said to be the longest in the world, guests gazed out over red geraniums and formal lawns. Beyond the treetops lay Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, inland seas with a thinning late summer traffic of sailboats and freighters. Farther away in the mist was the forested tip of the Lower Peninsula, a land out of Longfellow. As unofficial hosts, the Vandenbergs were among the first to arrive. On the sunlit porch, the senator, reclining on a chaise lounge and smoking his inevitable cigar, listened to stately hoofbeats as carriages bearing new arrivals came to a stop below. He weighed potential allies and adversaries, whom to buttonhole and when. The press knew where to find him. A young reporter named Liz Carpenter shared the main floor governor's suite with its deep windows opening on the western end of the porch. Vandenberg's lobbying on behalf of his proposed declaration, and this was a declaration, a very mild one, that would speak in favor, putting the Republicans in favor of some form of post-war organization. Vandenberg had been among those fighting the League of Nations as a young editor after World War I. Now Roosevelt was calling for a United Nations, and Vandenberg was trying to get the Republicans to come out with a mild support of that. So his lobbying on behalf of his proposed declaration was typically performed one-on-one, often on a stroll that paused at the far end, right outside the reporter's window. We flattened ourselves on the floor of the suite and heard a good deal of Vandenberg's persuasiveness, Carpenter recalled. He was there to persuade his party to give up isolationism. And I just stop there. But the first piece of quoting the Argentine ambassador's wife was a marvelous sort of discovery, one of those wonderful moments in your research where a wider world opens up. I was reading through Hazel Vandenberg, Arthur's wife's scrapbooks at the Bentley Library in Ann Arbor. And both Arthur and Hazel kept these scrapbooks where they pasted every social event, every political speech, every meeting, newspaper coverage into their scrapbook. And Hazel had been at a society tea or something, and she'd written in the margin of that, where they list all the guests present, that Courtney, a friend of hers, the Argentine ambassador's wife, Courtney is said to be writing down everything. And I saw that and I wondered, this was a woman who had been a debutante in Chicago, who and her third husband was the Argentine ambassador's wife, so she became a prominent Washington hostess. And it turns out that her unpublished papers, about 3,000 or 4,000 handwritten pages in the Library of Congress, her diaries, are all there. And if you read through, she has these wonderful, she was a great writer, she has these wonderful descriptions of the social life in Washington in the 1930s and 40s. And so Hazel's little comment in her scrapbook led me to that collection in the Library of Congress, which led to these wonderful sort of images of Vandenberg as the slightly tipsy senator at an embassy party. And then the Liz Carpenter, this young reporter, that name may be familiar to some people. She was press secretary in the Johnson administration, and Lady Bird Johnson's press secretary, but also did press work for LBJ. And her very first job as a reporter was working for a syndicate of Michigan newspapers run by a woman named Esther Van Wagener Tufte, whose brother was former Governor Murray Van Wagener, and therefore she had access to the governor's suite at the Grand Hotel, which is no longer in that location, but was then, and brought along Liz Carpenter, who's this reporter crouching down with her neck on the floor with her ear to the window, listening to Vandenberg talk. And she was still alive, and I was able to interview her. And in fact, I don't even think I used her quote in this book, but talking about her recollection of that meeting, she would say, I can still see the footprints on that porch and that was where isolationism ended for the United States. Now, that was a little premature, but again, one of those magical moments that you just sort of stumble into that opens a wider world.
Right, and he was a very strong man, but it was to read that, to see how he was willing, as the world changed, he was able to make some adjustments in his very strong beliefs to more match what was happening in the world in the day, which is it's pretty amazing for a politician of his stature to be able to do that and not lose face with everybody in the party. I know he was criticized by quite a few, but he still maintained a respect in the party for the most part till the end. I mean, he was a big voice.
it was a little bit of the reformed sinner too. He could bring people along with, he had credibility because he understood where the others were coming from. And so he could kind of gingerly lead these Republicans on this balancing act. They needed someone they could follow who kind of had been there and understood the challenge they faced. And so that gave him a lot of credibility with his peers that if he'd always been an outspoken maverick, he might not have had.
Right. Right. True. True. Yeah, that's interesting. What advice would you give to aspiring authors, especially authors who are interested in Michigan topics or characters?
Well, I think once we, again, for those of us who haven't written that much or who feel like ourselves are as barely established, once we say Michigan writers and Michigan characters, we do somewhat limit ourselves. I mean, you probably not, there probably aren't too many Michigan subjects that you're going to take to a publisher in New York and get an advance for. So automatically we're looking at something different in that way. But I mean, first, it's a subject you're passionate about, not something that someone says you ought to write because it might make a good story. You've got to be engaged and stimulated, and certainly in the case of something involving a lot of research, engaged with something like we were talking about earlier that you can live with and be ready to bore your family and friends with by taking every anecdote. I mean, I could turn every, current political discussion into something, well, Vandenberg said this, or Vandenberg, this was his view on the subject. But be able to internalize it and live with that internalization. And then I think it's so great to sort of be turning over rocks in our own backyard and discovering wonderful stories and wonderful treasures. That it somehow makes it more special that it's part of the Michigan experience, that we can look at Mackinac Island and suddenly realize more dimensions of its richness as a place. And I think writing about Michigan, either in fiction or in nonfiction, it resonates and echoes all around us in wonderful ways. It's sort of like having the lakes around us.
Right. And I've been working with the Michigan Notable Books program forever. I mean, I don't know, 20 years. And the amazing thing to me is every year there are so many good books by Michigan authors about Michigan topics and subjects that you wonder, is it ever going to dry up? I mean, and we have to narrow it down to 20 books that we recognize, and it's hard. There's a lot of talent in this state and a lot of stories to be told, and it's fascinating each year to get to discover those through the Michigan Notable Books program. And hopefully our program helps shine the spotlight on a lot of different books and lift a lot of different topics and encourages people to explore the state of Michigan and all the great books out there that they can discover.
I was going to say that I think the Notable Books is you've really championed the Michigan story in so many ways. It's really gratifying to see how your program has blossomed.
Well, and you've received a lot of acclaim in your career. What did it mean to you to have your book be recognized as a Michigan Notable Book?
I was tie it back to something I've mentioned, reading Tom Lynch's book, Booking Passage, and talks about his first book, which was a volume of poetry, as kind of a passport to another world. Now, do you know Tom and his books been part of Notable Books?
They have, yeah.
And so he's written a lot about his work as an undertaker, funeral director in Milford. And so, I connect a little bit with him because we both come out of having other occupations. His is one that lends itself to a lot more drama than a retail store might, but both of us have these other lives and then explore other things in our writing. And so I really identified with Tom when he said, that first book came out, it was like a passport. I could now travel among writers with a sense of myself as a writer, now that I had that book come out. And I think Notable Books has that sort of imprimatur that it conveys to someone like me to feel like, wow, yeah, I'm part of this cohort that coincidentally you hope has something interesting to say and reflect about our state, but just people I was associated with in 2018 for the award. I felt privileged to be in that group, and so you were bestowing on us a recognition and a legitimacy that makes that next book more likely, instead of saying, it came, it went. It's a Michigan Notable Book. Maybe I should try this again.
Yeah, we've had so many different types of books, and and we've had the Jim Harrisons and the Richard Fords, who've received Notable Book Awards, and they really, they're going to sell their books with or without the Michigan Notable Books program. But we've also had authors that have actually said, "Hey, my book got a Michigan Notable Book Award, and now the publisher wants to do my second book." It makes a difference. Wow. And it was a run of 1,500 books, and we sold all of those, and they're going into a third printing. So it's cool to have that kind of impact on smaller books, in the sense of smaller budget, smaller press, not smaller in importance. It's cool to see that kind of impact. And even a book like yours that is a pretty serious history of that person in that time. If we encourage some people to say, you know what, maybe I should crack a biography of a historical figure. I haven't done that for a while. Hopefully we have turned a lot of people on to some books that they might not otherwise have thought about. Why do you think people should read? Reading one, I encourage everybody to do more of it, but read regional stuff, Michigan stuff. And how has your active support of Michigan writers and Michigan reading, how's that enhanced your life in some way? Why is it's important to you? Why is that? Or why do you feel more people should see it in maybe the way that you see it?
Just as we talked earlier about how if you don't write the biography of someone, or they don't get to tell their own story, they slip through the cracks of history. There are tremendously gifted people in our state or writing about our state, and a New York publisher or a publisher elsewhere isn't going to instinctively be drawn to that necessarily, and there's a lot of talent that could slip through the cracks. And whether it's the program at Wayne State or the Michigan Notable Books, these are means to celebrate some of what's the best in our state, to recognize artistic achievement. It's like having having an art museum that can mount a show of regional talent. Now that word regional doesn't have to be the kiss of death that makes it ignored in New York because only people in that region are going to be interested. It's a way to bring forth the talent of that region and showcase it in a way that it might slip through the cracks otherwise. I guess that's how I would think about it.
Yeah, and it's funny because some authors seem to embrace this idea of regional Great Lakes Michigan author, and some others are more reluctant because they say, well, that's going to limit my audience, or I'm an American writer, I'm not a Michigan writer. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because people go both ways with their view of what that means and how it might cause people to look at their creative work, and I get that. Yeah. So is there anything else that you would like to share with folks about writing, about your books, or anything? We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think of writing as an ongoing way of looking at the world, and it provides, it's both mental exercise, but it also is, um, I it's like going to the eye doctor, and you try out the different lenses to see which ones give you the best vision. And so I had this lens of understanding the world through my grandfather in the first book, and then making adjustments and bringing into focus the world the way Vandenberg looked at it, and now trying to think about very different sort of vision with Frank Murphy, and that I just find that endlessly stimulating, and it's fun to have this sort of project that you're always, I mean, it must be, I always kind of envy gardeners, but it's like always having something growing. I think the writing process is like that too. And so that really keeps me going, and I find it an indispensable part of life. And I correspond with fellow writers, and somebody says, well, I don't know if I want to take on another book. I don't look at it as a burden. I look at it as I always want to have another book. And so there's something that keeps you young too. And so no, I think Michigan Notable Books is one of those stair steps along the way that helps keep that sort of attitude alive.
I hope so. I went back and I didn't reread the whole thing, but the Thrifty Years book that you wrote, and just preparing for this, and it takes me back because I grew up outside of Ionia, and going to the old Meijer's Thrifty Acres, and had everything. So I bought my 45s there, and it was to go into town from 10 miles out to go to Meijer's Thrifty Acres. That book reminded me of that era of my childhood, which is great as well. So I want to go ahead.
And that's what, I mean, when we say regional, was Jim Harrison regional? Was William Faulkner regional?
Right.
And I don't think of Liesel's writing as regional, but it's grounded in a real sense of place in northern Michigan. And fiction writers maybe can transcend it more readily than nonfiction writers, but we can savor where we are much more if we have a sense of place. If you can always discover more in the world around you, the world's a lot richer. And I love that.
Agreed. And thank you very much for taking time to talk with me today. Thank you for being a supporter of Michigan Notable Books. It means a lot to us, and I can't wait for your next book. Hopefully it won't take 30 years.
It better
I'll be dogging both you and Lisa for the next book.
No. Be patient with us, but thank you so much, Randy, and it's a real pleasure visiting with you. Thank you.
Yeah, take care. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.